So you joined me today on a lake not far from my Oxfordshire home, and although I'll be delighted if one of the £30 commons that live in here turns up today, it's not actually the real reason why we're here. So instead I'm here to film one of the Trigga-ing memories pieces, which is a chance for some of the Nutrabaits team to look back over their favourite sort of captures over the years. I've got to admit, when I first was asked to do this, it was quite a tricky thing to think about, because I've been fortunate, I've caught some great fish on Nutrabaits products over the last 25 years or so. And so from my sort of thoughts, I was like, well, which one do I pick? In the end, however, I was drawn to one particular period of my angling, and that was down at the fantastic Ashmead fishery down in Somerset. And so I decided that that's what I was going to go with, and I was going to talk about my Ashmead memories. So in terms of where everything began for me with Ashmead, it was actually nowhere near Somerset. It was up in sort of North Lincolnshire, in fact, sometime in 2007. So we're going back a good few years now. And I was at a work party in the winter months, really, and not like today. It was fairly sort of rainy, overcast, and like you do when you're working away, we were fixing some swims, I think, from memory, and we were chatting to a few of the other guys there, and one of the chaps started talking about this lake he'd heard of down in Somerset, and that was the first time I actually heard the name Ashmead. And he sort of described this place, and he was like, I'm good friends with the guy that owns it, and he's got these plans, and he's going to restore this incredible wetland area, and there's already some pools there that contain some fantastic fish. And immediately I sort of started to prick up with what he was describing. My ears were immediately listening a bit more to what he was saying, and a little bit less of the work I was supposed to be doing on the work party. And the more he described the nature of the place, this idea it was going to be lots of stalking opportunities, lots of sort of pools joined together with narrow sort of streams and rivers, it really sounded a bit of me. And then he said, oh, and by the way, there's a 50-pounder potentially in there. And it was at that point where, you know, growing up in Hull, not particularly a hotbed of carp fishing, and there certainly wasn't any 50-pounders near me at that point. There was maybe at best perhaps a couple of low 40-pounders in the whole of sort of the Yorkshire and North Links area at that time. And it's going back a while, so it was before the days of social media, and the internet was just starting to get going with some of the forums, but there wasn't really the same sort of sharing of information and knowledge that there is now. And a lot of it was still word to mouth and people chatting to each other on the bank, and also the Carp Talk, which I would regularly read every week and look at the pictures in there. And the idea of a 50-pound carp was just mind-blowing. So we finished up the work party, and we went on our way, and all the way home I kept saying to my dad, we need to find out more about this lake, we need to find out more about this Ashmead. I think my dad was a bit more sensible at that point, and he was like, do you even know where Somerset is? I've got to be honest, at that stage I probably hadn't really taken that into account. I just heard massive carp, stalking, amazing wetlands, and immediately sort of jumped into when can we go. My dad gradually sort of came round to the idea, although it was potentially 5 or 6 hours away. We had some trips to France at that point, and maybe this might be something that we could sort of fish in on a similar kind of basis, perhaps go down a few times a year and have a few longer sessions. So I badgered him enough that he eventually got back in touch with the guy we'd been with on the syndicate work party, and got the details for the person that owned Ashmead. And we found out at that point it was a guy called Mark Walsingham, or Skeff as he was to become known to us over the years. And Mark, immediately we sort of had the phone call with him, and we hit it off a little bit. You could tell how passionate he was about fishing and the environment in general, and just the idea of what he was potentially trying to create at Ashmead sounded quite special. He was really open with us at that point and sort of said, look, at the moment we have a main sort of fishing pool which is known as Goat Willow. It's about 3 acres, and that's been where most of the fishing has taken place over the sort of period that Ashmead has been run as a fishery. But there's also other areas around Goat Willow. Goat Willow itself was about 3 acres, but potentially there was this whole 17 acres of wetland and other pools that Mark was looking to basically restore, join together with Goat Willow and create one spectacular fishery. We seemed to make a reasonable impression on Mark, and he basically invited us down to go and have a look round, a chance for us to see what we thought about his plans. I guess him to meet us for another, a bit more in person and see how we hit it off. So we found ourselves not long after that driving all the way down to Somerset, basically to meet Mark in person and to have our first look at the fishery. it's one of those things. I think the excitement when you're driving down somewhere, and especially when you've got a longest journey, both me and my dad, we weren't really sort of like sure what we were going to find and what to expect. But all of the way down, we were sort of saying, well, could it be like this? And what if it's like that? And, oh, there might be a chance to sort of fish in this way. And it really sounds like it could be everything we've been looking for. We eventually sort of arrived in Somerset, and as we made our way nearer and nearer, sort of turned off the main roads, the A303, through a little village, and then started to go along a long sort of dusty farm track. And my experience tells me often that the longer the farm track, sometimes the better the fishery at the end. And it's fair to say that anyone that's been to Ashmead will know it's a fair old way along that farm track down to the fishery at the bottom. But eventually we made it down there, and Mark was there to meet us at the gate. And yeah, similar to how we found him on the phone, he was just a fantastic guy. It was clear straight away that he'd got some really, really brilliant plans for what he was going to do. And we fell in love with the place, I think, that first day. So after Mark had met us at the gate, he started to take us around a tour of the Ashmead fishery, essentially. We started with the 3-acre girt willow pool that I'd had fishing since the 1970s, was very much the most established part of the complex so far. And it was wonderful to walk around and see some of these incredible fish, and some big fish as well, swimming through the clear waters in and out of the weed. We could also see the potential of the rest of the 17 acres. Although in parts it looked like a bit of a quagmire where the diggers had been in and he'd been sort of landscaping and recreating and taking some of the silt away, you could very clearly see how incredible this fishery was going to become once he joined all of the different parts together. And the idea that the fish that had already grown to some incredible weights in 3 acres, once they potentially had 17 acres to explore, there really was some exciting potential there. We'd hit it off with Mark. Everything had gone brilliant on that first day. And as we drove away, he sort of said to us, look, guys, we really like you. If you'd like a place on the small syndicate we're setting up potentially next year, you'd be very welcome. I think both my dad and I couldn't believe it, really. The look that we'd kind of, from a work party up in the north to potentially this amazing new opportunity and somewhere that we were both going to be really able to enjoy. From my side, things were to get even easier in some ways, because I actually got a job not long after that down in Oxfordshire. And so I found myself moving from Hull a lot nearer to Ashmead. And I'm not going to say it was the only reason that I took the job, but it certainly was a nice bonus that rather than be 5-6 hours away, I was suddenly only going to be 2 to 3. So the following year then, all of the work had taken place on Ashmead. And Mark was essentially ready to reopen it in its new version. We went down for the opening weekend. There was all of the sort of guys that were going to be part of the syndicate on there. We did a little bit of work building the hut and some of the final bits of work that needed doing, and just had a really great social. It was wonderful to meet some of the other guys there. I think you could tell straight away that there was a lot of people that had really bought into Mark's vision and dream, and everyone you met was just someone that you'd be more than happy to spend a few days fishing with. And that always makes such a difference when you're driving somewhere and you're thinking, regardless of whether I catch anything, it's a beautiful place to be, and there's going to be some other fantastic guys there and some great company. My first actual fishing trip to Ashmead wasn't to be for another few weeks. I went back for the first time, I think in around July time, and I'd got a couple of nights in front of me. I was obviously excited. I was driving down that track again and thinking, you know, there's potential here for a fish bigger than I've ever caught in the UK by quite a long way. And there's also some incredible backup fish as well. I settled in and had a good walk around, got lost a couple of times going across the various bridges and onto the various sort of like islands and points, and just really trying to get my head around how the new layout was going to work. And I saw plenty of fish as well. Obviously it was early days at that stage. They'd suddenly got this new home to explore all of the original fish that had been in Girt Willow. And also there was potentially some newer fish as well, some younger fish that had been in some of the other pools that were suddenly connected up with all of the others. That first particular trip, I'd found what looked to me to be quite a few fish in an area called New North. It was kind of a point as far as you could go on one area of the wetland essentially, and I'd got weed beds in front of me and channels to my sort of like right, as well as some open water directly in front to fish. I dropped a couple of rods in for that first night. Nothing had particularly happened, but I'd woken up the following morning for my first sort of full day on Ashmead of fishing, and not long after, one of the rods is away. obviously in my head I'm thinking, this, what could this be? So I was a little bit surprised when a £4 common popped up. That was my first Ashmead fish, and it was undoubtedly one of the ones that had been in perhaps one of the other pools, and when it had been joined together was suddenly enjoying its freedom and the chance to sort of swim around this new amazing 17-acre complex. I actually had another 5 or 6 fish that morning into the evening, all of sort of like varying size up to around 11 or 12 pound, beautiful commons, big shoulders, and you could see the potential for how they could become much bigger fish. But obviously not quite what I'd hoped for, but I'd caught some fish. I was happy in that sense. The second sort of night was fairly quiet again. As I came into the second morning, there was still signs of the odd smaller fish in front of me, but I decided to have a quick walk around and just have a quick look elsewhere. I'd got a few hours left, just in case there might have been a better opportunity before I had to go home. There was another guy that had been fishing a different area of the wetland, over sort of towards Tom's and an area called Craggy Island. His name was Graham. It was nice to have a chat with him, and while I was walking past, he actually had a lovely £30 common. He'd been doing really well from that particular area, and the average size of the fish he'd been catching, he'd sort of found quite a lot of the original stock from Goat Willow seemed to have moved into that area early on in the syndicate, and it was really inspiring to see that fish, and it certainly gave me a sense of what the potential was. After I'd given sort of Graham a thumbs up and said well done, I kept on walking around, and I found a couple of fish, including a really decent looking common myself, just not far from the car park. It was an area of Goat Willow, so part of the original pool, and they were staring up the sort of like the bottom there, and they were just coming in and out of this weed. And I'd only really got 2 hours left, but I decided, look, it's got to be worth a quick go for these fish with one rod. So I packed everything away quickly, barrowed my way back. The fish was still there, carefully sort of crept into position, parted the reeds, waited until these fish had moved around into the weed bed and managed to lower this rig into position. It went down lovely, and I could feel it was clear on the bottom there. Hadn't disturbed the fish, I could still see them sitting there in the weed. Flicked a couple of baits in ever so carefully and sort of like crept back, pushed one sort of buzzer in there in amongst the reeds and just sat the rod there on that, and sat well back from the edge really. And for the next hour I was watching these couple of fish come in and out. They were starting to pick up the odd bit of the free bait I'd put in. Both Mark and Graham had come and were with me at that point, and they were sort of giving me a bit of stick. That there's a fairly sort of famous saying that Mark has that most of the Ashmead regulars will know, where he sort of says a better angler would have caught one by now. And I must admit, I very much felt that I probably should have had a bite. There was a couple of fish there, they were feeding, not put that much freebies in, so I was sort of starting to scratch my head, and time was ticking away, and I knew I had to go in the next 5 minutes, and then that time was up, and I thought, just give it 5 more minutes. And I had to actually be at an event at work that evening, so I was on about the fourth sort of like last 5 minutes, but that really was the point where I thought, I'm pushing it fine here, I'm going to have to leave. And at that point there was just an eruption in the water, and the rod buckled over, and suddenly I'm playing a much better fish, and I'm doing battle with my first proper Ashmead carp. It took me into the weed, and because I was at fairly close range, fortunately I was able to get it out and keep it moving. And it wasn't long after that this big common surfaced. Slipped the net under it, and just at that point Mark came back along and said, oh, you finally had one then? We lifted it out and did a couple of photos in the sunshine. It was a fish known as the pissed common, which has got a slightly sort of outturned mouth. So it's one of the quite recognisable fish in Ashmead, and at just over £30, it was a brilliant way to start my first session, or to end my first session, but a great way for me to start on Ashmead. And yeah, as I quickly packed away and rushed off home to make it to work in time, I was over the moon and was really looking forward to getting back. It was actually to be a few months before I had a chance to go again. With Ashmead being a fair way from home, I knew that it was somewhere that I wasn't going to necessarily get to fish every weekend, and that I was going to need to plan my trips a little bit. And in a way I didn't mind that, because it was nice to have something to look forward to in between the trips. And it was also one of those places where, even though I wasn't necessarily going all the time, because of the nature of it and being up close with the fish and being able to often find opportunities, I never felt like I was disadvantaged by the fact that maybe there was gaps between me going down there. They'd obviously liked the Trigga ice that I'd started using on that first trip, the fact I'd caught some of the smaller commons and then the big common on that last morning. I was fairly confident in the bait, and so yeah, as I went back for my second trip in October, I was feeling quite excited in truth and looking forward to it. My dad was going to join us for the first time. He hadn't been able to come with me in July, so this was going to be potentially his first trip down there. And it was nice to just think we'd have a bit of a social between us as well. So that trip, it was much later in the year, it was October. It was harder to find the fish at that point. You know, when we'd been there, or I'd been there earlier in July, they'd often been up on the surface. It was fairly easy to see sort of where the fish had been or where they'd been feeding. October, it was, the fish were a lot more sort of hidden away, a bit lower down. So there was a little bit more sort of gut instincts on where to go. We'd done a good couple of laps and Dad had got lost this time. I'd sort of had to go and find him on a couple of occasions. But we'd particularly been drawn to an area known as Tom's Pond, which is the bit when you first come in on the right hand side. And again, it's one of the older parts of Ashmead. And it just looked a bit more coloured, and there was just signs of fish there that, although we couldn't necessarily see them, it felt like a good shout to start with. So Dad had set up on one side of Tom's, and I'd basically set up on the other with an island between us. We could see each other and wave if either of us got any fish, but we were both fishing our own little bit of water. We'd got our rods in, it started to get dark, and it was really dark that October. I remember, for whatever reason, it was one of those nights where it was just pitch black and you could barely see anything. A couple of hours into dark on that first night, and one of my rods is away. And again, it felt like a decent fish, a bit like my experience with the Pist Common. It was just heavy air, holding deep. I flicked the head torch on as it got nearer because I was going to struggle to net it without, I couldn't even see the fish. It was that black. And so, yeah, flicked the head torch on, and then suddenly this giant appeared. I slipped the net under it. It was a big mirror this time. Now, I'd known when I joined Ashmead that there was this 50-pounder, a fish known as single scale. This wasn't single scale. I could clearly see it didn't have a single big scale on its side, but it was a big fish, and my guess was, from looking at it in the net, it was the second biggest in there, a fish known as moon scale. And it wasn't long until I'd shouted Dad, and I actually had to sort of like ring him, I think, because he was deep asleep. But he'd came round, and between us, he immediately looked in the net and was like, "That's a PB, son. That's the biggest fish you've caught in the UK by quite a way." So yeah, we got it up on the mat, and he was right. It was just over 41 pounds. Just blown away. 2 trips in, and I've caught a 30-pound common on my first trip stalking at the end, and this trip I've caught a 40-pound mirror and a new PB. Yeah, when we'd sort of thought of joining Ashmead, this was everything we could have hoped for and more. Yeah, we did a couple of pictures and slipped it back. And moonscale's one of the fish that I always was really fond of in Ashmead. It had been in there for a long time, and it had initially sort of, I think, escaped an otter attack a long, sort of many years before. And Mark had got some pictures of it where it sort of been quite damaged at that time, and it had come back and recovered. And it was one of those fish that just seemed to live life to the full, in that it would spawn really heavily and drop quite a lot of weight at spawning time, and then it would eat for a lot of the year and put that weight back on again. And it was a real sort of character of Ashmead. And yeah, I was absolutely over the moon to have caught that fish so early on. I didn't have anything else myself that trip, but fortunately my dad had a fish the next day, which was great. I think it was a mid sort of 20 that he caught, and so to get him off the mark as well, we both went home from that Ashmead trip. Again, absolutely delighted. Couldn't have wished for a better start, really. It was then sort of the next year before I was back at Ashmead, and I went a few times over the next few years, really, and I always treated it, like I said a few minutes ago, as somewhere that I looked forward to going. I kind of enjoyed my trips, but it was somewhere that there was some fantastic fishing on offer, but it was also just a nice place to be. And so I didn't want to necessarily go too often and be there all the time and chasing one particular target. I just enjoyed being there. I caught some nice fish over the next couple of years, and just enjoyed sort of somewhere to have a break from work, essentially, and just, yeah, rejuvenate and enjoy myself. My next experience of one of the Ashmead sort of A team, I guess, in a way, was to come in 2011. And it was an early season sort of trip. I think it was February, sort of March time. And I'd taken my friend Paul Brown on a guest session, and I'd fished with Paul ever since we were kids, and he lives up in Teesside, so it was a real trip for him down to Ashmead from there. But we always try and get the odd social trip in and just enjoy sort of fishing together. And he was excited about the fact that he was getting to go to Ashmead, and I was sort of glad to be back for my first trip that year. The weather was really cold. I fished round on one of the islands where Maxwell's, which has got a little bridge, and you actually walk out over a channel and you fish literally off your own little island. And it's one of the sort of unique experiences about Ashmead in some ways, because you potentially stagger your rod slightly, so that you end up with a rod behind you fishing one little channel, and then potentially a couple of rods in front of you fishing a different area. And it's something where it's one of the few occasions where I make use of the tone setting on my buzzers, because if you get a take in the middle of the night, you need to know which direction to run. So I tend to set a really deep tone if I need to run behind me, and the slightly sort of higher tones for the rods in front and to the side, so that I'd know if I got a take which way to run. I was fortunate, even though it was very, very cold that trip. It was frosty, it was minus sort of like degrees each of the nights we were there. But I was fortunate to get an early morning bite, and it was from the rod behind me. So there was that really deep tone. I sort of staggered out of bed, ran round, grabbed the sort of icy rod and the net. I remember trying to pull it off the ground because it frozen solid. And I was playing again what was a decent fish in this sort of like this back channel there behind Maxwell's Island. And this fish popped up, and I could see immediately it was one of the older fish in Ashmead. And it was one that's actually called the Grey. And it was just over 33 pound. So given how cold it was, and you know, it was a beautiful fish, I was again absolutely over the moon. It really was sort of like freezing that day, and then amazingly, as we were due to pack up, as is always the way, the weather started to turn, and a much milder sort of front came through that last sort of evening and morning, and we got a lot of rain, and suddenly all of the sort of ice turned to wet and clay. And part of what I think makes the Ashmead fish do so well, I think, is that there is this sort of clay nature to the lake, but the banks surrounding the fishery, anyone that knows that's been there in the winter or in the colder weather, that the clay becomes interesting to say the least. And barrowing back, Maxwell's was quite a long way from the car park, and barrowing back, I realised that the clay was going to probably be a challenge here. And within 100 yards, my wheel on my wheelbarrow had got completely covered in clay so that it wouldn't turn. So I had to stop and quickly sort of scrape that off with a stick I found, then do another 100 yards. The clay had started to gather again. And I think it took me about an hour to eventually make my way back to the car. It was still peeing it down at this point, so everything was soaking wet. I was absolutely covered in clay, but I'd caught a fantastic carp, so I didn't really mind that much, even though it took me about a week to dry the car out once I'd got home, and certainly most of the gear out. But it was another special Ashmead memory. Moving forward to the next year then, so we're in 2012 now, and I was still using the Trigga ice. I'd got no reason to change, in honesty. I'd been doing well. I was turning up, the fish were feeding on it whenever I was on fish, so it was working brilliantly. But at the time, the guys in the Nutrabaits factory had sent me in sort of the box of my Trigga ice order a little bottle of something that was to become Blue Oyster under the counter special flavouring. And they basically said, oh, you do a bit of floater fishing, we've got this in the, you know, in sort of something we were having to play with, maybe try it on the floaters and see what you think. And they'd sent some to my dad as well, and both of us had done just that. We'd added it to our sort of floaters, and we'd had some quite impressive reactions, really, where we'd been sort of like putting these floaters in and getting really confident responses. And I remember ringing my dad after one of the sort of early trips and saying, oh, I've just had this brilliant day's floater fishing, you know, I've had 5 or 6 fish, and they were just feeding really competitively. And him saying, oh, that's interesting, you know, I've had a couple of really good sessions with it too. And it just seemed to be one of those things that just often would turn the fish on and just maybe get them feeding, or maybe feeding just a little bit harder. So that particular trip where I was going back to Ashmead in May 2012, I decided for the first time, you know what, this has worked great on the floaters. I'm going to start drizzling a little bit of this on my Trigga ice, and just to see it. You know, it seems to have a good reaction on the surface. it potentially can't do any harm. And that particular session, I'd walked around and found some fish on one of the other sort of island areas, a swim known as Wilson's. And again, you go across a little bridge and you're fishing on this little island all to yourself. And there was a few fish about in that area, and it was May time, so they were cruising from weed bed to weed bed. And yeah, I'd found some fish there, and so I'd flicked a couple of rods out, and I was feeling sort of fairly confident I was on fish. And it was interesting. I'd not been fishing very long at all, really. And I'd put these sort of blue oyster coated Trigga ice baits out, and within maybe 10 minutes, 2 or 3 fish that were sort of going past another weed bed had actually turned and swam and immediately dropped down where I'd put that bait in. So my confidence is feeling pretty good at this point. I'm thinking, okay, I've got fish in front of me. They've come down and fed within an hour or two of me putting bait in, really, and it was the middle of the afternoon, so it wasn't necessarily a time I'd have expected them to be feeding that hard. And that was to become, you know, a sign of the next couple of days, where it was a bit of a red letter session. And I think I ended up with 5 fish in total, including another one of the big mirrors, a fish known as Opal, which was 38 pound 10 ounces. I also had something that really surprised me, where the second morning I had this slightly odd take where suddenly whatever I'd hooked just came to the surface and just went like a torpedo as far as it could, sort of to my right. And I was thinking, this is weird. This fight is just not like anything I've had on Ashmead before. I'm thinking, is it sort of one of the big commons, or, you know, long and lean and powerful? But it was just so fast. And eventually it wrapped itself up in a bit of weed, and I was able to gradually bring this thing towards me. And I netted this ball of weed and sort of let off a bit of a sigh of relief, to be honest. And that was a mistake, because suddenly the ball of weed erupted, leapt 3 feet in the air out of the landing net and disappeared again. I was at a complete loss now as to like, what is going on here. This is not normal sort of carp behaviour. I managed to turn this thing back and get it back in, and there in front of me was a grass carp. Now, I'd not actually realised that Ashmead had many grass carp in, and talking to sort of Mark, to Skeff, he said there's very few of them, and I don't think at that point necessarily any had been caught, or possibly one other. So to catch a grass carp, it was sort of upper doubles, but a lovely fish, and yeah, real surprise in that sense. And along with the other carp that I'd caught, I'd had a couple of nice 20 pound commons, and a really pretty one of the sort of smaller scaly mirrors as well. It was just a fantastic session, and the addition of the blue oyster, whether it made any difference, you'll never know. You know, they might have been feeding anyway, but from my side and from a confidence point of view, it's something that I've continued to do to this day, and I've caught a lot of other good fish doing it, both on the top and the bottom. So yeah, I always tend to have some with me, and often have a few drops on any of the baits I'm using. So we jump forward a bit again now, and I'm still going through a few sessions at Ashmead each year, and just enjoying it as much as ever, really. Obviously, when I'd first joined, and I'd mentioned at the very start that there was this 50 pound fish, single scale, and I think, like a lot of people, it's what made me first sort of particularly think, oh my God, I've got to find out more about Ashmead. But the more that I'd fished there, the more it had become so much more about just one fish, and more than just about one fish, and just about the Ashmead experience. But there was always that chance. I'd seen single a few times in the weed, and it had been caught by some other anglers on the syndicate, and it always just, it maybe came out once or twice a year, and it always just looked incredible. So I'd gone back for this sort of session in May, and yeah, as always, there was always in the back of my mind, you never know, there's always that chance. But I was just essentially driving down there to hopefully have a few days enjoying myself and see what came my way. I'd fished for the first night in an area on the east bank of Goat Willow, and I wasn't really feeling it. There was a bit of sort of stringy kind of weed there on some of the clearer areas, and so even though it felt like you were potentially fishing, if you wound in a few minutes later, often you'd got these little bits of sort of like cloudy, sort of puffy weed around your hook bait, and it just didn't feel quite right somehow. So although I'd seen the odd fish in Goat Willow, and I'd gone for a walk on that second morning, and I just had a look to see what I could find elsewhere, and I'd walked around the back, and there's an area known as the Gallops, and as I'd come into that area, I'd seen 2 or 3 good fish sort of like moving just in between 2 of the weed beds in front of that the Gallops area, and I was ready for a change. And seeing those fish there, I didn't see much else anywhere on the rest of my walk round. So yeah, I moved over, and middle of the day I'd sort of like moved over, and with the aim of getting the rods in, I guess, thinking, oh, potentially bite time was often at that sort of stage, early in the mornings through till sort of 9-10 o'clock. And so yeah, I'd moved around, got my gear into position, got the bivvy up, and dropped a couple of rods out into this gallops area as quietly as possible. And I'd actually rang my girlfriend Jen at that point, and sort of she'd have been asking how it'd been going. I said, oh, you know, I wasn't really feeling it the first night, and I'd seen a few fish, so fingers crossed, you know, that maybe I'd made the right sort of decision in moving. And midway through the conversation, sort of 5 o'clock in the evening, I've just got this one toner. So I've thrown the phone down, ran out and obviously picked up the rods. So this fish has come to the surface, and I can see this single scale on the side, and immediately, like, I've turned to jelly. Fortunately, there was 2 big areas of weed in the gallops at that time, and single had sort of like gone to the left and almost was such a big lump of a fish. It's reached this weed, realised it can't easily go any further, and turned around and gone to the right, and then it's gone, I can't get any further here, and gone back to the left. And yeah, so I've just got this sort of like 5 minutes of it going backwards and forwards in front of me. Eventually it sort of like came towards me, and I was managed to net it somehow first time. I'm looking down, and this is the you know, the biggest fish I've seen in the UK by a long way. And I know straight away it's single. I've seen the scale on the side. And yeah, still, I almost couldn't believe it. I think sometimes when moments like that happen, you're slightly in disbelief, I guess. And I can still hear, I can still see my phone's on the bed there where Jen's sort of been rudely cut off. So I thought, well, I better ring her back and just gather myself for a second. So I've carefully made sure the net's sort of like sat, and single sitting there in the deep margins, getting her breath back. And I've gone and I've rang Jen back and sort of said, I'm really sorry about that. I've just caught a fish. And she said, oh, she's really excited, great. And I said, yeah, I think it's the biggest one in the lake. And she just was like, really? Yeah, I was like, yeah, I'm almost certain, you know, just, it's crazy. This is crazy. Like middle of the afternoon, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, like this just, I don't know what to do with myself. And at that point, I sort of said, right, I'm going to ring Skeff and see if he can come down and give me a hand. And one of the other sort of syndicate members, Mickey Gray, was fishing just up the bank on Goat Willow, so I gave him a quick shout as well, and they both came down to give me a hand, thankfully. And Mark had brought his 2 young lads down with him, Ian and Ali, and between us we took some photos, and it was just a magical sort of like 5-10 minutes of just sitting there looking at probably the best fish I'll ever catch, and a new personal best at 55 pound 10 ounces. Mark did some brilliant took some brilliant photos on the camera, as did Mickey as well, and it was amazing. Ali, Mark's youngest son, actually laid down next to single scale, and just to see the size of single scale next to Ali was hilarious in a way. So we finished off taking the photos and slipped her back, and off she sort of went back into the depths, and I was sitting there really with a massive smile on my face, and it had become a bit of a custom at that point. I think something that Mickey had actually started was if you caught one of the decent fish, you went down to the local co-op and bought a bottle of Chateau Neuf de Pape to celebrate the most expensive wine that they did, and brought it back and had a few glasses of wine. So I wound in the other rods and found my way sort of heading off down to co-op to get this bottle of wine. And I'd found a couple of bottles on the shelf and gone up at the till to pay, and it was only at that point that I realised that the cashier was giving me slightly odd looks. And I looked down and realised that I was sort of like covered in mud, basically soaking wet on my joggers on the sort of bottoms where I'd been in and out of the margins, and actually had some weed on my left hand shoe, and so I was trailing various bits of Canadian pondweed round co-op while trying to buy a £50 bottle of wine. So it must have looked a little bit odd to them. I could see why they were giving me weird looks. But yeah, we took it back. I took the wine back, and we had a few drinks to celebrate. And I must admit, that evening I didn't actually put the rods back out. It just started to rain at that point, and I remember just laying on the bed chair, and the rain was sort of tapping away, and I just felt a complete peace, just as happy as I could possibly be. And yeah, just incredible moment, and I slept just like a log. Now the next day, I sort of woke up, and the carp world is, you know, there's a lot of anglers out there fishing for carp these days, but there's still quite a small sort of core to the carp world, I guess. And the news had got out fairly quickly, and my phone was sort of ringing. There was various guys from the BCSG gave me a ring to sort of say well done, and some of the other guys from the syndicate, and various other sort of mates I'd fished with over the years. And it was just a wonderful day, really, of just sort of chatting to people, reliving that story, and, you know, of single scale appearing and going left and right from the weed beds. And yeah, it was just everything I could have ever wanted from a session, really. And I had one fantastic moment where one of my mates rang me, and we fished together for years, but he very much likes different things from his fishing to me. And while I'm happier to sort of sit it out sometimes and look for the odd better fish, he just loves getting bites, and he always thinks it's crazy when we go together, we need to go somewhere where we're going to catch quite a few. And yeah, he rang me up and sort of said, "Oh, I hear you've had this fish." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Oh, you had anything else?" And I was like, "No, just the one." And he was like, "Oh," he said, I couldn't have been doing with that. And, you know, I just caught the fish of my dreams. And yeah, his first response was, "Did you catch anything else?" But yeah, it made us laugh, and it was a lovely sort of way to end that particular trip. So yeah, I went back home after that, and it was one of those things, really. I'd caught single scale, but it wasn't the end of my Ashmead sort of like adventure, really, because I just loved going down there still. And there was a couple of big commons that I'd not caught, and just the experience of being there and catching up with Skeff and some of the other guys, from my side, I planned to sort of continue fishing it just as I always had done. But there was actually to be quite a big change that winter. So Mark had made the decision that for various reasons he was going to leave his job and needed to change things, and was going to actually run Ashmead on a slightly different basis. So it wasn't going to be run as a syndicate anymore, but instead was going to be done as a sort of exclusive bookings where groups of people could book Ashmead or book a place on Ashmead, and go and get to fish it for 2 or 3 or 5 days. And that was quite a shock, I must admit, because, you know, I'd been a part of the syndicate for a number of years by this point, and it was going to be quite a change. But I fully understood why he was going in that direction, and he'd got sort of plans to run it in a way where, rather than it be a syndicate, it was going to be open to a much bigger group of people. But he was still hoping to keep that kind of Ashmead family feel, and he was fairly careful about how he was going to promote the fishery and the people he was hoping to attract to fish there. So I decided to go ahead and book on for a session as part of this sort of exclusive bookings, and that was to be the case for a couple of years, where I'd sort of go back once each year, and me and Dad potentially would go at the same time, and we'd often try and get a similar week to some of the other guys that we knew. So Dave Preston joined us on some of the trips, and Mike Starkey came along on one of them, and one or two of the sort of other guys that we knew, and it had a really nice feel to it. But it was different, all arriving together at the same time, and there being either a draw for swims or agreeing who was going to go where, and sort of knowing that there was going to be the other people dotted about the wetland, rather than it just being sometimes where I'd been the only person there, or there might have only been 1 or 2 others in the syndicate days. So that first sort of trip after everything had changed was in September 2016. And from my side, I'd kind of gone, you know, I've obviously caught single scale the year before. I'm just going to have a great time with my dad, and I was very open about, you know, I let him sort of choose where he wanted to go and the other guys first, and I didn't really mind where I ended up. I was happy to sort of like let the draw take place and just pick whatever from whatever was left, really. And the other sort of anglers had chosen and settled into their areas, and there was a spot when we were walking around that I just quite fancied. It was in sort of Tom's Pond, and it was an area I'd done well in sort of like the autumn sort of period, and the fish seemed to like it down there at that time of year, and it just looked really good. There was sort of quite a lot of weed down there that year, but there was one particular spot where I just really fancied that I could get a bait in position where the fish were going to come in and out of these weed beds, but I could get really nice line lay back to the bank. And that was something I'd found over the syndicate years, that the line lay and how you fished for the Ashmead carp was in some ways really vital. And I was aware with all of the weed and the nature of it, I was never going to get perfect flat line on the bottom to my spot. But if I could find areas often where I could almost like lay my line over the back of the weed and down, then sometimes I could imagine that line would look just like a bit of, you know, it blended into the weed almost. And it was something that I'd done, you know, quite successfully in the syndicate years, and this spot looked perfect for it. But there was only really room for one rod. And I think I got the odd sort of like look from some of the other guys when they would walk past me that, well, where's the rest of your rods, Martyn? And I actually only fished with one rod that trip, just because this spot was perfect for it. And there was no point me trying to squeeze a second in and potentially making the fish aware that I was there or having to sort of break some of the weed. So I was just going to fish with one rod. I was happy with that. Maybe if it didn't work out after the first night or two, I'd perhaps look around and maybe put a second or a third out. But for that first night, it was just going to be the one rod on that spot. And that was to pay off really well in that I actually caught 4 fish just fishing with that one rod over the next couple of days. The biggest was a fish known as Patch, and that's one of the real sort of like nice fish in Ashmead. It's a big fully scaled, and I was lucky to catch that at just over 31 pound. And it looked fantastic. It was really looking in good shape. I also caught one of the other sort of really nice scaly mirrors, a fish known as Plato, which was a lovely 20 pounder, and a couple of other good fish as well. And just fishing there with that one rod was, yeah, the spot was right, the fish were there. And yeah, it was again a great sort of few days. My dad was fishing elsewhere, and he was on the main sort of Goat Willow pool, I think, and he'd caught a lovely 30-pound cormorant as well. We had a couple of really nice sort of socials back up at the hut with the rest of the guys, and although it was different to the syndicate days, it was just a new type of Ashmead experience, and I'd really enjoyed it, and the booking sort of model seemed to work really well. So I booked again over the next couple of years and sort of followed that pattern really, that I went down once a year, and we had some sort of like great sessions, and it was always lovely to see sort of Mark and Shona, his wife, and the rest of the family, and whoever was booked on for those particular trips. And the next sort of like exciting, I guess, moment to talk about as a significant memory was actually in 2020. So I'd had those sort of trips for the next few years and caught the odd one along the way, but I was due back in September 2020 and had no idea as I was driving down that year quite what Ashmead had in store for me. And we'd had the usual sort of draw and walk around, and it was sort of late September, so again, I'd not seen particularly much walking around, but there was an area that you just got that feeling sometimes on Ashmead when it might just be the water had a little bit more colour, or there was something sometimes about areas that looked like the fish were there, but also the opposite, where you could sometimes walk around in areas that looked fairly clear and didn't look like the fish were there. And that's very much what I was doing on that particular walk around before the draw there, that I didn't really see a lot to go on, but I'd seen areas I didn't think the fish were, and there was one area that looked just a little bit better than everything else I'd seen. It had been fishing quite slow apparently the previous week, and I don't think there'd been much caught. So as we went into the draw, I'd got an idea that I was really hoping to get this sort of area, and it was one of the sort of far sort of channels, the Square Bay, off the point that's just to the right there, and that's where I was really hoping to get. I think I came out of the draw third, and the first two guys had picked somewhere different. So I was straight away, yeah, go Square Bay, that point. And Ashmead's a bit different to a lot of fisheries that, unless you've kind of been there and seen it, it's hard to explain, but there isn't really swims as such, there's more kind of areas. And so when you draw on Ashmead, you draw this area, and that's one of the things I think I love the most about it, that there isn't just cut out swims, but that you kind of pop your bivvy wherever you want, and then you sort of place your rods into little gaps in the reeds potentially, or gaps in the weed, and yeah, and so this area of the Square Bay and the point there was where I really wanted to be. So the second I'd got that in the draw, I was feeling good about it. My dad hadn't actually joined me on that trip. He couldn't make it that year, so I knew one or two of the other guys on that week, but and Mark himself was actually going to fish, which was really nice. So everyone else seemed happy. We finished the draw, and they'd all got areas they liked the look of, and everyone kind of went off and made their way and started getting set up. And the draw, I think we'd done at around 2 o'clock. So by the time I'd got my gear and barrowed round, it was sort of getting to sort of 3-ish. And as I'd barrowed past the sort of the area with the Square Bay and the point, I'd actually seen a fish, and I'd moved slightly where I was going to fish. And sometimes luck plays a big part in what you sort of catch, I guess. And I'd been lucky at years before to even get a place with Ashmead and that work party, and luck was about to sort of play its part again in seeing that fish as I was walking past. So it was the area I was going to fish was sort of slightly to the left, but I'd seen this fish just to the right of my kind of area. So I quickly moved my gear and sort of came 10 yards back up the bank. and got a couple of rods in position. And again, although I could have fished with 3 rods if I wanted, I was only actually going to put 2 rods out. Just because I had a feeling that there was 2 areas I really liked the look of, and I'd seen the fish in one of them, and the other sort of rod would go perfectly not that far to the right of that, but I didn't feel like I wanted to squeeze 3 rods into this area. It just didn't quite seem right for it in a way, so I left one of the rods in the quiver and got these other 2 rods out, and I'd probably set up and got sort of the bivvy and everything, and again, you know, thinking that I'd probably be hoping for a bite maybe the following morning, or maybe during the hours of darkness at that time of year, and so I'd sat on my bed chair and I'd just started to put a bit of tea on, and it was around 6 o'clock, I suppose, about this sort of time, 6:30, and one of the rods is away. Again, bit in shock, you know, that quick, but fantastic. So I'm playing this fish, and again, as a lot of the Ashmead fish, when you hook some of the better ones in there, it's close range. You often know fairly quickly when you've got a decent fish on the end, and this felt like a good fish, and up popped a big mirror. It went in the net. I quickly sort of turned the net on its side. I could see there was no big single scale, and it was my friend's sort of moon scale. That fish had caught all of the way back in 2008 on one of my second ever trip at Ashmead, and here it was again, sort of 12 years later, and it looked sort of again, looked like it was going to go over 40 pound. So carefully sort of lifted it up on the bank, took a couple of quick photos, weighed it, and it was just over, I think it was 40 pound and 4 ounces. What a way to start, you know. I've been fishing literally 3 hours at that point. With any sort of session, when you get a fish like that early on, the rest of the trip really, you can just relax into it, you know. You can enjoy it because you've had a great fish already. Everything just seems great, you know. You're sort of in a position where you know the spot's working, you know, trigger ice is still working, and in that regard, I was just over the moon with the start. So I flicked the rod back out and sort of sat back down, finished off the bit of tea I was eating. It's just started to get dark by this point, and the other rod's away. So the second rod that had been sort of like, that had flicked out early on, is away with another fish on, and this feels even bigger than the first. So straight away I'm thinking, well, I've just caught moon scale, and this feels like heavy, seriously heavy, and I just couldn't believe it when up pops another giant mirror and straight in the net, and this time there is the big single scale on the side, and I've only gone and caught single scale again, but to catch both single scale and moon scale, the 2 biggest fish in the lake, essentially within 90 minutes of each other, within a few hours of arriving, like, you couldn't make something like that up, you know. If you'd have asked me what a dream session would have been driving down that long track, that I would never in a million years said I'm going to catch the 2 biggest fish within 90 minutes, you know. It just things like that just you can't sort of like plan for. And again, I was a bit in pieces really, even though I had been lucky enough to catch single scale before. It's just such an incredible fish, and I rang Skeff, and I'd already rang him to tell him about moon scale, and I think he thought I was taking the mick, to be honest, you know, when I rang him, and he goes like, you haven't? And I was like, I have, it's here, like, it's in the net. So yeah, fortunately he came round, and as before, he gave me a sort of a hand with everything. We took a sort of quick couple of photos this time, because it had got dark by this point. Quick couple of photos, checked that she was all okay, and let her go. And yeah, she was just over 52 pound. What a start, you know, what a way to start that particular session. But it was to get even better over the next couple of days. That seeing that one fish and that little bit of colour in the water, there was clearly quite a lot of fish in that area. And the following day I was lucky enough to catch one of the lake's big commons, a fish known as Gale, at 36 pound 2 ounces. And it had really been the big commons that I'd still been sort of going back and getting really excited about the idea of one of these commons coming along. So that just was the icing on the cake, having already caught, you know, the 2 big mirrors the day before. And then the final sort of day, I was down for 3 days, and that final day I caught another big common, a fish known as Tubbs, at just over 32 pound. Yeah, what a way to sort of end what is, you know, an incredible session, and definitely the best 90 minutes fishing I think I will ever have in the UK. That trip in some ways was a sign that things were going to change again, and you know, I've talked a little bit about Ashmead moving from the syndicate days into the the exclusive bookings, in that Mark and Shona had actually decided that they were going to sell Ashmead. Unfortunately, the Carp Society came up with an acceptable sort of offer for Mark, which means that its sort of future is secured as a fishery. And I know that the Carp Society sort of do seem to get the Ashmead ethos and the sort of the environment that Mark had tried to create, really, which had always been as much about create a great sort of like environment for the wildlife, and the carp will flourish. And they'd certainly done that, but the other sort of like wildlife on there, the range of sort of bird life, and the amount of sort of kingfishers and owls and foxes and just all of the sort of like the dragonfly and the fauna and the flowers, it had become a really special place, and it had really sort of grown up even in the years that I'd fished there, and year on year you could see how Ashmead had sort of changed and developed, and it's nice to think that the Carp Society potentially will keep that going, and they've continued with the sort of bookings model, so people can potentially go and enjoy Ashmead and get to experience that kind of style of fishing for themselves, which is quite hard to find in truth. From my side, you know, that sort of brings to, I've been back again this year, it brings us up to date. I had a lovely trip earlier this summer and caught a nice mirror, sort of a mid-20 mirror. As ever, the consistent thing all the way through for me, and why I've chosen this as my sort of triggering memories has been the Trigga ice, and I'm fairly certain I'll be down at Ashmead again in the near future, and I'm almost certain it'll be with Trigga ice. So thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the story. I've certainly enjoyed having the chance to sort of sit and reminisce and tell it, and it was lovely to sit and look through some of the pictures, which will hopefully appear throughout the film. I hope you've enjoyed the piece, and if there's anyone else that you'd like to see from the Nutrabaits team, or any other memories that from some of the Nutrabaits guys you'd like to see covered, then why not comment and let us know in the comment section below. Thanks.